Joining me now is the one and only Alex Drane. Alex is co founder and CEO of ARCHANGELS, and previously she founded Eliza Corporation, Engage with Grace, and three other companies, all bootstrapped. She is also a cashier on leave for Walmart, and she served as wellness expert for Prudential. She believes retail is the front line of health and that caregivers are our country's greatest asset, that we need to expand the definition of health to include life. She is beautiful inside and out, and her work has always inspired me and so many others. So thank you so much for being here, Alex.
I'm so happy to be here. And I have to start by saying, oh my God, I love your mom. And to you for everything you've done all day, like you have been extraordinary. And I was on from the beginning this morning with Sanjay, and I had taken so many notes on what he was saying and what you guys were talking about together. And I just have to restate them back because I think your mom and Sanjay were either dating or hanging out together or who knows what, because he said in your discussion this morning, to best care for ourselves, we have to care for each other, and talked about the notion of reciprocal altruism. And, you know, your mom, the world goes better with compassion and love. When thinking of other people, you're happy, and reminding all of us to sort of pay it forward, right? That we can be happy when we go pay it forward with other people. So I miss your mom, and the thought that that was in October. And you and I talk a lot about grief. And so I'm just loving on you, loving on the extraordinary gift you've given all of us all day today. And I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much. And I'm missing all the hugs, her hugs, hugs of people at the conference. And this is probably her third or fourth conference appearance. This is your third or fourth conference appearance. You both have been, pillars for this community. And, like you mentioned, you and I have so much in common this year, beyond our passion for improving health by designing for life, where we've both been caregivers. We've both lost people who we love dearly. I witnessed my father-in-law decline and pass away from dementia last year, and then lost my mother to glioblastoma. And I cared for her part-time for 2 months, and full time for 2 months. And so I saw the beauty and the challenge of caregiving through the eyes of my mother-in-law, my husband, my father, my siblings, and myself. And throughout that time, I just kept thinking about you, like, wow, the work that Alex is doing to shine a light on the needs of caregivers is just so important.
Well, it's interesting because we lost my sister-in-law, Zah, at 32 to glioblastoma, as you know. So I know that condition very, very well. And I know what it is to be a caregiver of somebody in that role. And we lost Antonio's mom, actually, because I think there's a similarity here, which I just want to call out, especially at this very particular moment in time with COVID. Antonio's mom was diagnosed with a number of situations, of which she ultimately, we knew for sure mid-January that we didn't have much time. We chose curative care. We were very lucky because of some of the decisions we made with Antonio's sister, where we did not talk openly about how to make sure Zah lived her very, very best days until her last. And the system took over, and Zah was young, and we ended up having a textbook case of overtreatment. We made a decision, that was what Engage with Grace was all about. We would never let that happen again. And with Antonio's mom, even though his culture is very private and doesn't believe in, literally the Sicilian, at least the part that Antonio is from, to talk about end of life is to make end of life happen, as opposed to this alternative notion that your mom just talked about, right? What if instead you use that time to say clearly what you want, but also, which is how can, do you want ice cream? Let's get you some ice cream. Like, what do you need? Let's do it. But also, how do you don't save eulogies for eulogies? And how do you love on the people that need to be loving on? One of the things that I don't think we talk about enough right now is there's another stage of being a caregiver. There's the active role of being a caregiver that you discussed. There's also that we lived, but there's another role that we're experiencing really profoundly with Antonio's mom being gone. We lost her exactly a month ago today. Antonio in particular, he had a whole other job in his life, which being a caregiver has some hard days and hard times, as we all know, but it's also a job that has a lot of purpose and gives you purpose. And we need purpose to be happy and to be healthy and to feel content. We need to care for others. And when the person that you've cared for has gone, you lost that job and you lost the protective component of purpose that goes along with the harder aspects of caregiving. And I'm sitting here thinking for you, Amy, like you had a lot of time that you worked 80 hours a week and you cared for your mom on top of that. And there's a quote by Edna St. Vincent Millay. It's usually used romantically, but I'll use it now in a different context, which is where you were, there's a hole in the ground that I find myself walking around during the day and falling into at night. And I see in Antonia when I feel myself, she lived with us the last year and a half. She's been with us intensely. And I ache for that. Like we want to call her, I want to talk to her, and I can't. And then I think about the fact, like Amy, you and I were lucky enough to be with our loved ones when they went. And there are a lot of people right now, this person that they care for enormously, and they might have lost not one, not two, but maybe three people. And they didn't have the luxury of being by the bedside. That individual that they care for and love was in a hospital. And I just think about how much grief. And I want to just say to everyone out there, like, we see you, it's a lot. We got to love on each other. I don't know how people aren't self-combusting on the sidewalk, because things can be hard. So anyone who's, got someone that they're caring for, we're loving on you. And if you know someone who's caring for someone, if you know anyone who's had a loss, like let's avoid the grief saturation that I think our culture is feeling right now and try and fill ourselves up by loving on others.
That's such a beautiful message, Alex. And, caregiving, like you said, that the grief is wrapped up in that. And I'd love to talk with you about that. But you've done so much research on caregivers and stress and what they're facing and what's important. And I would love for you to share the data you compiled with this community, because we need to know. We're designing for people that may become a caregiver, are a caregiver right now, were a caregiver, are in a stage of grief. So we need this information when we're designing health experiences. So I'd love for you to share.
Yeah.
So we're just going to pull up the slides.
Okay. So I'm going to do, thank you. Let's bring up my slides. Patrick, if you don't mind helping me, Patrick is a genius behind the scenes who's been making all this stuff happen so beautifully all day. Thank you, Patrick. So yes, actually, I want to run through some of the data because it matters so much on so many levels. So if you can take us to the next slide. By way of context, Amy mentioned ELISA. And while I was at ELISA, we started ELISA in about 2000, early 2000. While I was there, we did over 1 billion interactions with people about their health. And what's interesting about being an entrepreneur is usually I have found, especially as a bootstrapping entrepreneur, that the ideas that we came up with on our own were stupid and didn't work. But when we listened to what people wanted, a fundamental element of design, people will tell you what they want. And so we were reaching out using our technology to interact with people on what we thought we were supposed to do on behalf of healthcare, which was take better care of your diabetes, get a mammogram, get your colon cancer screening. But our technology was uniquely two-way and had a listening functioning capacity, was speech recognition. And we used it in an outbound way. And what we heard back from people to a resounding degree was, I would love to take care of my health in the traditional way, but I can't because my mother with Alzheimer's just moved in, because I'm hating my boss so much I can't breathe. And we came around to this notion that maybe the biggest diseases in the US are not asthma or diabetes or cardiovascular disease, but actually these life challenges. And we call them the unmentionables. And we said we have to expand the definition of health to include life, because when life goes wrong, health goes wrong. We built a really sophisticated analytical model to measure the impact of these life challenges on our health. And that was the whole story behind ELISA. And Patrick, if you'll take me to the next slide, in parallel, there is my beautiful sister-in-law, Za, who was diagnosed with glioblastoma the night I got hitched to her brother, my man. And there in her arms is Alessia, who is now 19, to give you a sense of time, and moonlighting with archangels on the side. Za should have spent her whatever time she had left. She had 7 months. I bet if we'd put her in palliative care and ultimately on hospice care, she would have had double that. And she would have had a lot higher quality of life. So each of us, let's remember, sometimes the best gift we can give someone we love who's in this situation is a palliative care consult. So note to self, I wish I had done that earlier. And Engage with Grace was all about how do we get this conversation started way before we have to. And so when I left ELISA, what we decided was we wanted to work, my co-founder Sarah and I, on the overlap between these two things. And that was caregiver stress. And specifically, we thought of caregiving as the epicenter of what I'll call life sucks disease, which was our other term for the unmentionables. So Patrick, if you go to the next slide, the first take at Archangels was to really more on the movement side and to make it possible for us to be able to see who these caregivers are and to love on them fiercely for what they're doing. And the name Archangels was all about being more aspirational. If you're an Archangel, you're a badass warrior angel, and we need to be like showing how strong and loving you are. You're like spreading your wings out over this person that you're caring for. But I will also say that it was a big fat failure. And if you go to the next slide, I had a midlife crisis and decided to go work at Walmart because I felt like I lived in a bubble. And I wanted to get out of that bubble and get closer to humanity, and realized within 3 days of being a cashier at store 2660, shout out to store 2660, that in fact retail is the front line of health. And all of these beautiful tools we're building and making sure that people have access to if they come into the healthcare system, we need to bring them out to where people are. And that started Archangels Take Two. And Archangels Take Two, if you go to the next slide, is you can think of it as a movement and a platform, both angles, both sides, right? It's got technology, but it's also got the movement that's reframing how caregivers are seen, honored, and supported using a combination of data and stories. And we also have this public-private component, since so many employees have to leave their jobs because of their caregiving responsibilities or never get to start a job in the first place. We also have a public and advocacy component that we do as well. So I'm going to run through some data with you guys really quickly. This matters from a design perspective. So Patrick, get ready because we'll go fast. When we asked in a recent national sample, are you worrying about or caring for the health of a family member, a neighbor, a friend? Next slide, a full 66% of folks right now say yes to that question. So if we could look to our left and look to our right, 2 in 3 of us would be in this situation right now. If you go to the next slide, we also have an idea in our head of who an unpaid caregiver is. We think it's an average, like it's an older 46, 56-year-old woman who's caring for her mom, and that's true, and she is. But it's also this whole other population. So if you go click through the next 3 slides for me, I'm tortured that I can't click. I have click control issues. It's also a lot of people we don't think. 45% of unpaid caregivers are men, 1 in 4 are millennials, and 1 in 5 are Gen Z. So we got to expand that definition, not just of health to include life, but also of who caregivers are to include this much broader population. And if you'll go to the next slide for me, before COVID at Archangels, we did not think of unpaid caregivers as including parents or guardians of healthy children. We did absolutely include parents or guardians of disabled children. I will tell you now, oh my gosh, and many of you are like sitting, I ran through my house before here telling everyone like, don't make any noises, guard the dog, everything to make sure I wasn't interrupted. If I had a 3-year-old kid or a 6-year-old kid, probably wouldn't have the control over that. I know many of you are in that situation. My heart goes out to you. If you go to the next slide, that's Erin, a coworker at Archangels, and that's Benjamin and Emmeline, and they are absolutely on our team. And we absolutely bribe them with popsicles or watching TV or whatever we have to, because Erin now is in this additional role where if school is closed or the daycare is closed, then she's in the role of needing to be doing that at the same time. So if you click through, what Archangels was able to do is publish a report with the partnership of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association that was looking at the health impact of caregiving. You go to the next slide. What we looked at first was, and the association had a really cool way of doing this, looking at claims and making some sort of logic patterns. And what they were able to show is, again, before COVID, if you were a caregiver, you already had 26% poorer health. And in addition, you were a high flyer, right? Which is that term we use for you were overutilizing the ER and had greater hospitalizations. And this was, next slide, especially true for millennials. 33% increase in ER, 59% increase in hospitalization. So in the olden days, before COVID, we were like, that's bad. We have to help these high-flying caregivers so that they get better support than having you in the hospital. If you go to the next slide, I will now say I yearn for the olden days, the good old days. Because now this is a study that Archangels, was on the research team, and our role was to get the caregiver included in this study that was published by the CDC. Now, if you go to the next slide, we're seeing that unpaid caregivers are delaying or avoiding medical care at 5 times the rate of the rest of the population. So if you're a caregiver, you're not going anywhere. You're not going at all You're not because you can't. You're not because you're worried about bringing COVID home. You're not because you literally can't get coverage for your mom or your neighbor or whoever it might be. So you go to the next slide. We did another study, and it was also published by the CDC. This was actually the first one that, go to the next slide, that actually looked at the impact of COVID on behavioral health of unpaid caregivers. So I want to benchmark against before COVID. Unpaid caregivers already had twice the rate of depression and twice the risk of coming down with clinical illness, chronic illness. If you go to the next slide, as of COVID, go to the next slide, that has now increased precipitously. So unpaid caregivers, 56% of unpaid caregivers, remember, 66% of us are in that role, have anxiety or depression, 2.5 times the rest of the population. Go to the next slide. And when we say things like caregivers are not all right, you can click through twice. We mean really, really, really not all right. In fact, close to 1 in 3 unpaid caregivers have had suicidal ideation in the 30 days before we did our survey, which was the month of June. And things have not gotten better since the month of June, as you guys know. So 10 times the rate of the rest of the population. It's really important to put that in your belly and think about that from a design perspective, from a human perspective, from a how do we love on people perspective. And if you'll click through one more time for me, Patrick, and thank you. That's what I want to say to this group and to you, Amy, and to everybody else. Like, Amy, you're serving as the caregiver to all of us today. You're playing an enormous role. Patrick, you also, to Amy, in all of us caring for each other and the roles that we play in our jobs. But many of us also are in this role at home. And it's so important. You just saw the data. So in addition to thinking about how this applies to the work that you do, please also think about how it applies to you, to the you that is you, and make sure I'm not going to say something silly, because if you're an unpaid caregiver and I said, you should take some time to care for you, like, that's silly. Unpaid caregivers know, like, what time? I'm just saying, just know that we see you and we're loving on you. And if you're not an unpaid caregiver, good Lord, do what you can to pay it forward and love on somebody who is. If you'll click one more time for me, Patrick. So, because what do we do when we're really stressed out? We self-medicate. It's absolutely something I practice on particularly bad caregiving days. If you click again, so 33% of unpaid caregivers have increased their use of substances to cope. Another thing Sanjay got at this morning when he was talking about deaths of despair. Caregivers make up a not insignificant percentage of folks who are having serious health consequences, including the increased use of substances. But sometimes, if you click through one more time, if you're an unpaid caregiver, you can't drink or do drugs or whatever else you're doing to self-medicate if it cognitively impairs you, because you've got to get up in the middle of the night and deliver medication or check on somebody, in which case many of us caregivers, this is my other favorite thing to do, we eat ice cream or we eat crap food or whatever else it might be that satisfies our craving to feel better in the form of food. So I hear you and see you if that's true for you too. Another important design component. Patrick, if you'll click through for me. And so this is really important, and this is really what we can end on. At Archangels, the platform that we're doing does have that data and story component. The tool that we use is called the Caregiver Intensity Index, and it's made up of a number of different sort of domains that contribute overall to intensity. And one of the things it returns for you is a score in your green, yellow, or red. Pretty self-explanatory. And I just want to show, before COVID, this was the distribution of low, medium, and high intensity. Post-COVID, so where we are now, you click through one more time, you can see what's happened. And it makes sense and it's obvious, but I just want to drive home the extent to which we're close to doubling, 8%, more than doubling those high-intensity caregivers, who you can imagine are much more likely to be having suicidal ideation, increase in substance use, delay or avoidance of medical care. So just important background information to know. If you can click one more time for me, then I'm just going to say thank you for being a caregiver. And that was all my slides, Patrick. Thank you. You're a very good slide clicker.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. That data is amazing, and we will make this presentation available to the audience so they can dive in and reference this work. We've been talking about grief and how caregivers are experiencing grief during caregiving, after caregiving, and many of us are experiencing grief just because of the year we've had to varying levels. How might we consider grief in the design work? we're doing, because any one of our users, our patients, our people, our colleagues could be sort of in this stage. So how can we support each other, and even at scale? But what are your thoughts there?
So a couple things. One, you talked a lot earlier today. Sanjay talked about the whole person and remembering that the whole person is there. And I think you should sort of presume that almost anyone you're talking to right now is having a very hard time. Like, just go ahead and presume that folks are suffering in some way. Nobody wants to be pitied and nobody wants to be, talked down to. So, how can we aspirationally lift somebody up by recognizing what people are going through and loving on them for it? And most importantly, sharing our own stories so that they know that they're not alone in what's going on. I'll go back to that Sanjay thing again, because he told that story about the Dalai Lama and he was having a hard time meditating. And the Dalai Lama said to him, "Are you having a hard time meditating?" And Sanjay was like, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Me too." So do that. Like, say to somebody who's close by you, and do this in your design work. Own your own stuff so that someone else feels less alone in owning theirs. And I think the last thing I'll say is, when you think about grief, there's a beautiful, my friend Sarah Islin sent this to me originally. There was a beautiful, beautiful piece about it, it was written by this guy. It was posted on Reddit. It went viral, about how grief comes in waves. And in the beginning, when you first lose somebody, so you're like in the ocean and the sea is out of control. These waves are crashing over you and you cannot catch your breath. As time goes on, those waves get a little lower and a little softer, and you can breathe, and then you can tread water. The important thing to remember about grief is that all of a sudden, out of the blue, a rogue wave comes, and you will find yourself, and I know this has happened to you, Amy, and it has happened to me, where I am, in the best mood talking about X, Y, or Z that Archangels is doing or we're rolling out, and someone's going to say something and I'm going to start crying. And I don't want to be that person who cries in a meeting. And I think just remembering that grief doesn't go away, that people suffer many types of grief, and that how we support grief has to be something that feels empowering and not deminimizing or pitying, is a critical thing from a design perspective.
Such beautiful words, and we can incorporate this into our work. Alex, I adore you as always. Big love to you, and keep
Years and
spreading
years.
this information and light.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys so much.
All right, take care, Alex.